I'm not going to say any specific article, but I just want to say something about the diversity in Trudeau's cabinet because I think outside observers are misunderstanding the situation. The cabinet has gender parity, which has been written about widely. It also features several members of the South and Central Asian community, including several sikhs, but it doesn't have anybody of African heritage, near or distant, or any East Asians. There aren't any Arabs, and I didn't get a chance to count the Jews, if there are any. There have been previously. Did he overlook these groups? What's the deal with that? Well, see, the question only makes sense if you're fundamentally misunderstanding the situation as some kind of affirmative action program, which it most definitely is not. The cabinet is not meant to address power imbalances in the country, but actually to reflect them. There's going to be a long takedown of an article about Brampton coming up shortly, and in it I point out that South Asians are actually one of the most powerful economic groups in Canada. The article was about the ghettoization of Brampton, which is absurd. Right, so to suggest that their communities reflect some kind of ghettoization of the suburbs is ridiculous on its face. It's an increase in affluence for these regions. They bring money in. So this is the reason the South Asians are overrepresented in cabinet. The South Asian community is very powerful. It's the most logical thing in the world, right? It's not a program to alleviate economic hardship for South Asians. It's a reflection of how powerful they are in Canada right now. Which is not, I'm not scaremongering or anything. I'm just pointing out that it's a reflection of what it is, right? I don't fear the Sikh community. I just point out that they have much representation in cabinet, are dramatically overrepresented in cabinet, because that's a reflection of the economic power that they have in the country. And it's not like North America's never seen that before either. Okay. Jewish populations have been overrepresented just about at every level for decades. I think everybody can agree to that. The reason is that they're disproportionately wealthy. So you see Jews in cabinet, you see Jews running for office everywhere at every point. Because they have a lot of money. They represent very powerful economic interests. You see them in lobbying groups all over the place, right? And so it is with South Asians in Canada in the 21st century. There's no mystery, nothing surprising, but it's not meant to alleviate poverty in the Sikh community. They're very successful here. The gender parity is a similar reality as well. It's not, meant to help the girls give a leg up. No. It's a reflection of the fact that women are no longer the junior partners in society. They're represented at the table because they have to be. It wouldn't be a reflection of the country if they weren't. It's not some kind of act of charity. It's an accurate reflection of where the power lies in Canadian society, and especially in Canadian business. So then where are the East Asians? The Arab Muslims? The African Canadians. In Canada, Muslims and, East Asians, the Chinese people mostly, right? We have a very small Japanese community. And I've never seen an explicit Korean community. We have a substantial Filipino community, but I wouldn't really consider Filipinos to be East Asians in the same way, because they don't have the same sort of relationship with communism. These groups lean conservative by huge margins, okay, because they're very business oriented. So one would not expect them to show up as prominent voices in the Liberal coalition. And where are the Africans? There aren't Africans in Canada. It's a complicated thing, but it's truth. Okay, so I hope that gets the reality of the situation across a little more clearly. The diversity in the cabinet is not about helping people, giving people a helping hand. It's about reflecting the actual power imbalances in society. And that just came to me as I was, reading the takedown of that article about Brampton. It's just another. Like I say, if you look at the stats, Asians do very well in Canada, and it's also reflected in the Parliament, right? I know that this is another, implosion moment, but you can look it up. It's not, I'm not just making this up. It's been written about fairly widely. In Canada, you want to think of East Asians the same way you think of Cubans in the United States, okay, but less explicitly anti-communist and more explicitly pro-business. I was talking about how immigrants can't come to Canada unless they have money. Well, East Asians come to Canada with money and they set up businesses. And they want free markets. The Conservatives present themselves as the party of freer markets, whether it's accurate or not. That's the propaganda they use. Okay, so the reason East Asians tend to lean so heavily towards Conservatives is because there's a widespread suspicion about government intervention in the economy in the East Asian community. Of course, I'm talking about aggregate. That doesn't mean that every East Asian person that you meet will vote for the Conservatives. It doesn't mean that every South Asian person you meet will vote for the Liberals. But overall, this is where the communities tend to lean. It's not identity politics. It's ideological, right? The fact that Muslims in Canada lean right is actually by design. The Conservatives went out of their way to screen Muslims to make sure they were religious. So there's been a big increase in immigration from Muslim regions under the Conservative government, and it was designed to make the country more conservative, which is going to flip Republicans out, right? The Conservatives actually brought Muslims in because they were Muslims and because they were conservative and because they were religious. Yeah, that's actually the truth of it. And it was a reaction, rightly or wrongly, to a feeling that liberal immigration policy in the 20th century was a type of gerrymandering, okay? So you had this big feeling on the conservative side of the aisle that the reason that the liberals embraced multiculturalism and brought people in from all over the world was because they wanted to screw with the balance, the ideological balances in the country. So bring in more liberals and the liberals will never lose, right? It's not really clear that that's actually true, but it's a widespread suspicion amongst conservatives in Canada. So they reacted by saying, okay, well, let's bring a bunch of religious immigrants in then. Let's bring a bunch of conservative immigrants. And, they no doubt would have preferred to bring in, Quakers, but, there's not a lot around there. So then the next choice they had was conservative Muslims, right? It's not clear yet whether that's actually going to be a bit of a problem in the long run. But I do believe that most people think that our social systems can handle it. That people will integrate over time. In the short run, Arab Muslims in Canada lean staunchly conservative on social issues. And when they do react, they tend to swing all the way to the NDP. So you don't get that representation in the Liberal caucus because it's just not there. That may change over time, but right now, the Muslim community in Canada is very conservative and supports the Conservatives by very staunch margins, very large margins. What about blacks? Are any blacks in Canada? What's with that? Well, there's kind of it's a complicated confluence of things. I mean, to begin with, we never really had I mean, we had some slavery in Canada up until like around the year 1750 or so, I think. It was whenever it was banned by the British, which was much earlier than the Civil War in the United States. But I mean, it wasn't chattel slavery, right? So it was like domestic servants type thing, right? We had that here, right? But we didn't, bring in these big shipments of slaves and attach them to the fields, and we never had plantations, nothing of the sort like that, right? So we don't have this big population of slave descended Africans, because we didn't have that here, and they didn't have it in the north either, right? So you don't have plantation slaves in Illinois, or descendants of plantation slaves in Illinois, because it wasn't there, right? That was a specifically something that happened in the south part of the United States, right? And and you had all this migration out of the region, at various points in American history. There was a border to Canada, so that's about as Canada was as far north as they can go. That said, we also had the Underground Railroad, right? I think that most Americans know about the Underground Railroad. And so we brought a lot of freed slaves into Canada in the 1800s, right? Helping people get out of pretty nasty conditions. But there's pros and cons of living in a free society, right? We get them over the border, but we didn't see freedom is what does that mean, right? If you've spent your entire life, like if you were born into slavery in the United States and you spent your whole life there, you've spent your whole life having somebody. I mean, yeah, the conditions were terrible. You get beaten, you have to work, but somebody's feeding you, right? You get out of that, and it turns out that you need to find a job, and you're used to working, sure, but what? And I'm not putting words in anybody's mouth, right? There's plenty of documentation of this. What a lot of the freed slaves found when they got to Canada was that it wasn't really much different, except that now you had more responsibility. They ended up working the same job, and instead of being given food and shelter, they were given money to buy food and shelter. And so I know that a lot of, today in 2016, the people that get the most angry about comparisons between chattel slavery and wage slavery are black people, American blacks. In my experience, anyways, tends to get a really angry response. But the people that made that comparison the loudest were freed slaves in Canada. They said there's no difference. You freed me, but all you've done is remove the chains. I'm still enslaved. I may have been moved to a less violent form of capitalism, but so long as I am in capitalism, I remain enslaved. There were a number of freed slaves that went back before the Civil War. Some people blame it on the weather. Maybe they couldn't stand the weather, but there was also a very large migration back after the Civil War, due to a desire to reunite with family. So, between about 1800 to about 1850, there were, tens of thousands of freed black slaves in the area that I live in southern Ontario. But by 1870, 1880, most of them had left. And after that, from about 1900 to about 1965, Canada adopted some very racist immigration policies. There was actually one prime minister that ran on the slogan, "A White Canada," Robert Borden, a conservative prime minister, and he won. It wasn't just blacks, right? It was Chinese. It was accompanied with some pretty brutal policies around our Indigenous people. That was kind of Canada's racist apex, was in that period in the early part of the 20th century. But after that, and specifically, it was during the government of Pearson that there was a big shift. We changed our immigration policy to a point system, and but what that's done is it's made it hard for American blacks to come to Canada because the system. See, I don't want to blame us for that. I want to blame America for that, right? I don't feel bad about putting barriers to entry that have to do with education. But the reality is that there are very stark difficulties for Black Americans regarding education, right? And that needs to change and everything else, right? But Canada is not going to bring or not going to allow immigration into Canada unless you have high education levels, which is very hard for Black Americans to achieve. So we have had a large increase. Like before 1965, there were no blacks in Canada, basically. Since 1965, we have seen an increase in the black population, but it's come either directly from Africa or from the Caribbean. So we have a large Somalian population that came, as refugees in the war. We've had lots of Africans from all over Africa come just because they became doctors or engineers or whatever, and they worked. They got their educational requirements. A lot of Africa is French, so in that sense, Canada may be a little bit more appealing than the United States if French is your first language, and etc. So we have had a substantial increase in African immigration since 1965, but it's almost all from the Caribbean or from South or Central Africa itself. As it is right now, blacks are less than 2% of the population, and there just really isn't anywhere in Canada that we have, overwhelming black populations, except a few neighborhoods in Toronto, and they're small neighborhoods. Like we're talking like a couple of blocks. And there is a substantial loyalist community in Nova Scotia. That's really the only black community that exists in Canada, is in Nova Scotia. So, why aren't there black people? There is one. As far as I know, there's actually only one African MP. Her name is Heidi. Heidi what? You know what? I've forgotten her last name. But she's from Vancouver. She's been an MP for a long time. She's kind of getting to retirement age. She has been in cabinet in the past, but she got left out this time. And it was kind of a thing when she was, right? So, but I mean, it's not to say that the Africans have not contributed anything to Canada. We had our Governor General was a Haitian for a while, and there have been other people that have contributed as well. But I mean, it's a small group of people, and they just don't have political power due to a lack of numbers. It's the lack of black representation in Canada is due less to systemic hierarchy and more just to very very small numbers in the population. It's the reality of it, right? So, what we're trying to get across is that this isn't meant to be, the world, combined into it's not a microcosm of the universe, right? It's just a reflection of where the power in Canada lies. And there's lots of Asians, or lots of South Asians, because South Asians have lots of money. That's all there is to it.